The call came at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late August, a time now etched into the architecture of my memory like a structural flaw in an otherwise perfect blueprint. I remember the precise glow of the digital clock because I hadn't slept. I'd been awake since 5:00 a.m., hunched over my drafting table in my San Francisco studio, burying my grief in the cold, hard logic of the Obsidian Heights project. I was staring at load-bearing calculations and steel frame specifications, trying to lose myself in the math of gravity and tension. Anything was better than the silence of an apartment that should have been filled with the laughter of 10-year-old girls. Anything was better than the haunting reality that I hadn't seen my daughters in 732 days. My phone buzzed, vibrating violently against the glass surface of the table. An unknown Los Angeles number pulsed on the screen. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. Los Angeles was where they lived now. Los Angeles was where Harrison Thorne had taken them after the judge, swayed by a stack of orchestrated lies, ruled that I was unfit. That word still tastes like ash and iron in my mouth. For a second, I stared at the screen, paralyzed by a mixture of hope and pure, unadulterated terror. Harrison had blocked my number. He had returned every letter, every birthday gift, and every desperate plea for a supervised visit. Why would someone from LA be calling me now? I picked up, my voice a mere rasp. "Hello. Is this Elena Vance?" A woman's voice came through, calm but vibrating with that surgical urgency only doctors can maintain under pressure. "This is Dr. Elizabeth Sterling from Los Angeles Children's Hospital. I'm calling regarding your daughter, Maya." Maya, 2 syllables I hadn't been allowed to claim out loud for 2 years. My breath hitched, caught in the wreckage of my throat. What happened? Is she hurt? Was there an accident? Maya was admitted to our emergency department in the early hours of this morning, Dr. Sterling continued. I could hear the faint, rhythmic beeping of monitors in the background, a sound that made my skin crawl. Her white blood cell count is critically low, 1/200 cells per microliter. To put that in perspective, the normal range starts at 4,500. We are currently running a full diagnostic battery, but based on the preliminary blood smears and her clinical presentation, we strongly suspect acute myeloid leukemia. The blueprints on my desk blurred into a smear of blue ink and white lines. Leukemia. The word was a wrecking ball, swinging through the foundation of my world. My 10-year-old daughter had cancer. "I need you to get to Los Angeles immediately, Elena," Dr. Sterling said. "Maya is going to require a bone marrow transplant, and the protocol dictates we test the biological mother as a potential donor immediately. Time is not a luxury we have." "I'm in San Francisco," I said, already grabbing my keys, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped them. "The drive. It's 6 hours. I can be there by noon." "Good. When you arrive, come straight to the pediatric oncology unit on the 4th floor. Ask for me personally." The doctor paused, her tone softening just a fraction. "Elena, I've seen the charts. I know the custody situation is complicated. But right now, Maya doesn't need a legal ruling. She needs her mother." I hung up and stood there for a heartbeat, staring at the Obsidian Heights plans. It was 6 months of grueling work, a $2.8 million contract that was the only thing keeping my struggling architecture firm from slipping into insolvency. My business partner, Marcus, was due at the office in 2 hours for the final presentation. The clients were flying in from Chicago. If we landed this, we were saved. If we didn't, the firm would be shuttered by Christmas. I didn't care. I grabbed my bag and dialed Marcus as I ran toward the elevator. "Elena, you're in early," Marcus answered, sounding upbeat. "You ready to wow these Chicago execs? We've got the 3D models set up in the conference room." "Marcus, I need you to cancel the Obsidian meeting, or handle it yourself. I can't be there." "What? Elena, are you joking? This is the biggest project we've seen in 5 years. If we don't present today, they'll go with the firm in Oakland. We lose everything." "My daughter has cancer, Marcus." I reached the garage, my heels clicking like gunfire against the concrete. "I'm going to Los Angeles, now." Silence followed. Marcus knew the history. He had been there the day I walked out of the courthouse in tears, having been stripped of my rights because a judge chose to believe a fabricated psychiatric report over the truth. He had watched me rebuild myself stone by stone, only to see me crumble every time a holiday passed without a phone call. "Go," he said finally, his voice thick. "Don't worry about the firm. I'll handle the clients. Just get to her, Elena." I threw my car into reverse and tore out of the garage. Drive down Interstate 5 was a hallucinatory blur of gray pavement, golden hills, and the oppressive heat of the Central Valley. I drove like a woman possessed, pushing 10 miles over the speed limit, my knuckles white as bone on the steering wheel. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Maya's face, not as she was now, but as she was the last time I saw her. She had been 8 years old, a skinny girl with Harrison's dark, calculating eyes and my stubborn, slightly upturned chin. The memories of the custody hearing replayed in my head like a horror movie I couldn't switch off. Harrison Thorne was a high-powered corporate lawyer, charismatic, wealthy, and deeply connected. When he decided he wanted the girls, mostly to hurt me for daring to ask for a divorce, he didn't just ask for custody. He executed a character assassination. He had hired a psychiatrist, a man named Dr. Arthur Strauss, who I later suspected was on Harrison's unofficial payroll. Strauss had authored a report that claimed I suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder, chronic alcohol dependency, and emotional instability. None of it was true. I had never missed an appointment. I had never failed a drug test, but Harrison was a master of narrative. He presented altered emails and took my frantic, heartbroken voicemails out of context to paint me as a woman on the brink of a psychotic break. The judge, a man who played golf with Harrison's senior partner, believed every word. The restraining order was the final blow. I was prohibited from contacting Maya or her twin sister, Chloe, or coming within 500 feet of their home or school. Harrison moved them to Los Angeles, changed their school records, and vanished into a life where I didn't exist. And now, after 732 days of silence, I was being called back, not as a mother, but as a biological resource. Los Angeles Children's Hospital loomed on the horizon like a fortress of glass and steel against the smog-choked sky. I parked in the visitor lot, barely remembering to lock the car, and ran through the automatic doors. The smell of the hospital, a mix of industrial floor cleaner and the heavy, sweet scent of illness, hit me like a physical blow. I followed the signs to the 4th floor. The pediatric oncology unit was decorated with cheerful murals of deep-sea divers and tropical fish, a cruel, vibrant contrast to the pale, exhausted children being pushed in wheelchairs down the hall. Dr. Elizabeth Sterling met me at the nurses' station. She was a tall woman in her late 50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that had seen far too much tragedy. She extended her hand, her grip firm and grounding. "Elena, thank you for making the drive so quickly." "Where is she?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Can I see her? Is she conscious?" "In a moment," Dr. Sterling said, her expression shifting to something more clinical. "First, we need to discuss the gravity of the situation. Maya was brought in at 3:00 a.m. by her father. She had been experiencing extreme fatigue, frequent nosebleeds, and significant bruising for several weeks. Mr. Thorne told the admitting nurse he thought it was just a lingering virus from summer camp." "Several weeks." I felt a surge of rage so hot it made my vision blur. He waited weeks while she was bruising and bleeding. Dr. Sterling's expression remained neutral, but I saw a flicker of professional frustration in her eyes. "I cannot comment on Mr. Thorne's decisions. What I can tell you is that by the time she arrived, her blood counts were catastrophic. She is currently stable on a ventilator and receiving a blood transfusion, but her system is compromised. She needs a bone marrow transplant as soon as we can stabilize her enough for the procedure. We need to test you, Mr. Thorne and Chloe." "Harrison has sole custody," I said, leaning against the cold laminate of the nurse's station for support. "There's a restraining order. He's going to call the police the moment he sees me." "Under California's emergency medical statutes, your rights as a biological parent are temporarily reinstated in life-threatening situations," Dr. Sterling explained. "Medical necessity supersedes custody arrangements when a minor's life is at risk. You have a legal right to be here for the testing and for the duration of the emergency. I have already informed the hospital's legal counsel. Does Harrison know you called me? Not yet, she admitted. He left about an hour ago to pick up Chloe from his sister's house in Pasadena. He is expected back shortly. I wanted to give you time with Maya before the situation becomes complicated. She led me down the hall, past room after room of sterile equipment. We stopped at room 412. Through the glass partition, I saw her. Maya looked impossibly small in the center of the oversized hospital bed. Her dark hair, which I used to braid every morning, had been cut short. Her skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, like fine parchment. And I could see the dark, purple blooms of bruises along her arms where the IV lines had been started. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was the only sound in the room. She's sedated for the transfusion, Dr. Sterling whispered. Go in. She may not be able to speak, but she might sense you're there. I pushed open the door. The air inside the room was cold. I walked to the side of the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached out, my hand hovering over hers, terrified that if I touched her, she might break. Maya, I whispered, the word finally breaking free of my throat. It's Mommy. I'm here, baby, I'm here. I took her hand. It was cold, so cold. I sat in the hard plastic chair beside her, leaning my head against the railing of the bed, and wept. I wept for the 2 years I had missed, the birthdays, the first days of school, the loose teeth, and the bedtime stories. I wept for the lies Harrison had told her. I stayed like that for 20 minutes, lost in a fog of grief, until the door behind me swung open with a violent thud. What the hell are you doing here? The voice was like a lash. I stood up, turning to face the man who had systematically dismantled my life. Harrison Thorne stood in the doorway, his expensive charcoal suit slightly rumpled, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. Beside him stood Chloe. She was taller, thinner, and she was looking at me with eyes that were wide with a terrifying mixture of recognition and fear. Get out, Harrison hissed, stepping into the room. You have no right to be in this room. You have no right to be in this city. I looked at my daughter Chloe, then back at Harrison. I felt the old fear trying to take hold, the familiar instinct to shrink back from his aggression. But then I looked at Maya, struggling for breath behind a plastic mask. I'm not going anywhere, Harrison, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I ever thought possible. Maya is dying, and I am the only person in this room who can save her. So sit down, shut up, and let the doctors do their job. Because if you try to pull me away from her today, I promise you, I will make the last 2 years look like a vacation compared to what I'll do to you in court. Harrison's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing to slits. For the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of something in his expression that wasn't superiority. It was the realization that the woman he had crushed 2 years ago was dead, and in her place stood a mother with nothing left to lose. The air in room 412 grew thick, heavy with the weight of 2 years of silence, and the sudden, violent intrusion of the past. Harrison Thorne stood at the foot of Maya's bed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his chest heaving under his bespoke charcoal suit. He looked older, the edges of his eyes mapped with lines that hadn't been there when he stood in that Portland courtroom, but the cold, calculating fire in his gaze remained unchanged. He was a man who viewed the world as a series of depositions, to be won and lives to be managed. I'm calling the police, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. I'm calling my attorney. You are in direct violation of a standing court order, Elena. You have 5 seconds to remove yourself from this floor before I have you forcibly escorted out in handcuffs. Harrison, stop, I said, not moving an inch from Maya's side. I could feel the heat of the ventilator, the rhythmic hiss of the machine that was keeping our daughter alive. Look at her. Just look at her for 1 second and stop being a lawyer. Chloe stood behind him, her small hands clutching the hem of her denim jacket. She looked at me, her eyes darting toward the floor every time our gazes met. She was 10 now, nearly 11, but she looked smaller than she had at 8. There was a gauntness to her face, a hollowed-out expression that made my heart ache. She was the brave twin, the one who used to protect Maya from the dark, but now she looked like she was drowning in a sea of adult secrets. "Daddy," Chloe's voice was a whisper, thin and fragile. "Is Mommy really here to help?" Harrison didn't look at her. He kept his eyes locked on mine. "Your mother is here because she's a predator, Chloe. She's here to cause trouble while your sister is sick." "Mr. Thorne, that is enough." Dr. Elizabeth Sterling stepped into the room, her presence acting like a sudden drop in temperature. She stood between Harrison and me, her white lab coat a barrier of clinical authority. "This is a Level 1 pediatric intensive care unit. This is not a courtroom, and it is certainly not the place for personal vendettas." "She has no legal right to be here, Doctor," Harrison snapped, gesturing vaguely toward me. "I have sole legal and physical custody. I have a restraining order based on her documented psychiatric instability." "And I have a dying patient," Dr. Sterling countered, her voice like flint. "Under the California Emergency Medical Services Authority, specifically the statutes regarding parental access during life-threatening crises. Ms. Vance's presence is not only permitted, but required for the diagnostic phase. We need to perform HLA, human leukocyte antigen, typing immediately. We need to find a donor match for Maya, and the biological mother is the first line of testing. If you interfere with that process, I will be forced to contact the hospital's ethics board and Child Protective Services to report medical neglect." Harrison's face went pale, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features. He was used to being the smartest man in the room, the one who held all the cards. To be threatened with a CPS report by a world-class oncologist was a move he hadn't prepared for. "Fine," Harrison spat, though he didn't look at me. "Test her. But the moment the needle is out of her arm, she leaves this floor. I want a security guard posted at the door." "That won't be necessary," Dr. Sterling said. "What is necessary is that we test everyone. You, Elena, and Chloe. Siblings are often the best chance for a perfect match, though we prefer not to harvest from a child if we can avoid it. But given Maya's condition, we need all potential data points today." I looked at Chloe. She was staring at the floor, her knuckles white as she gripped her jacket. I wanted to go to her, to pull her into my arms and tell her I hadn't left because I didn't want her. I wanted to tell her that every night for 2 years, I had whispered her name into the dark. But the wall Harrison had built between us was still too high. "Mom," Chloe looked up, and for a fleeting second, the unfit labels and the court-ordered lies vanished. I saw my daughter. "Are you sick? Daddy said you were too sick to stay with us." The lie hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Harrison had told them I was mentally ill, that I was a danger to them. He had framed my absence not as a legal theft, but as a personal failure. "I'm not sick, Chloe," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "I never was. I've been trying to find you every single day. I love you more than life itself." "Enough," Harrison barked, grabbing Chloe's shoulder. "We're going to the lab. Doctor, let's get this over with." The next 2 hours were a clinical blur. I was led to a small, sterile blood draw station where a nurse with kind eyes and steady hands took 4 vials of my blood. Harrison went next, followed by Chloe, who sat perfectly still, her face a mask of practiced stoicism that no 10-year-old should possess. After the blood was drawn, Harrison escorted Chloe to a private waiting area, refusing to let me speak to her again. I was relegated to the hospital cafeteria, a cavernous space filled with the smell of burnt coffee and the hushed murmurs of families in crisis. I sat at a corner table, my phone vibrating in my lap. It was Marcus. "Elena, the Chicago clients are furious. They're leaving for the airport in an hour. They're saying if the lead architect isn't at the table to defend the load-bearing specs, they're going with the firm in Oakland. Please tell me you can hop on a Zoom call." I stared at the message. The Obsidian Heights project. The $2.8 million lifeline. If I lost this, the firm was gone. I'd be broke, jobless, and even more vulnerable to Harrison's legal maneuvering. But then I looked up at the ceiling, thinking of the 4th floor, where Maya was fighting for every breath. "I can't, Marcus," I typed back, my fingers trembling. "I'm sorry. If we lose the contract, we lose it. I have to be here." I set the phone face down on the table. It buzzed again, but I ignored it. I sat there for hours, watching the sun dip behind the smog-filled horizon of Los Angeles, wondering how my life had narrowed down to the results of a blood test. Around 5:30 p.m., my phone rang. It wasn't Marcus. It was Dr. Sterling's office. "Ms. Vance, Dr. Sterling needs to see you and Mr. Thorne in the conference room on the 4th floor. Immediately." My heart hammered against my ribs. Had they found a match, or was Maya's condition worsening? I ran back to the elevators, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. When I entered the conference room, Harrison was already there. He was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by a woman I didn't recognize. She was in her mid-30s, polished, with blonde hair pulled into a tight, expensive ponytail and a sharp, fashionable suit. She had her hand on Harrison's arm, a possessive gesture that made my skin prickle. "This is Stephanie," Harrison said, his voice flat. He didn't offer a last name. "She's been helping me with the girls since you weren't around." I ignored her, sitting at the opposite end of the table as Dr. Sterling entered. The doctor looked tired, her brow furrowed as she looked at a digital tablet in her hand. She didn't sit down. She closed the door and leaned against it, her expression unreadable. "We have the preliminary HLA typing results," Dr. Sterling began. "I'll be blunt, we have a problem." "Am I a match?" I asked, leaning forward. "No," Sterling said. "You are a 3 out of 10 match. It's not enough for a safe transplant. The risk of graft versus host disease would be nearly 100%. Harrison cleared his throat, his lawyerly confidence returning. "And me, I assume as her father I'm the donor." Dr. Sterling looked at Harrison, and for a moment the room was silent. "Mr. Thorne, you are a 0 out of 10 match for Maya." Harrison laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "That's impossible. I'm her biological father. Even in the worst-case scenario, we should have a 50% haploidentical match. Check the samples. You must have mixed up the vials." "We didn't mix up the vials, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Sterling said, her voice dropping an octave. "We ran the test 3 times. We also ran a full genetic panel because the HLA markers were so anomalous. We used the maternal mitochondrial DNA from Elena as a baseline, and we compared it to the paternal markers in the girls." She paused, her gaze shifting between Harrison and me. "Elena Vance is the biological mother of both Maya and Chloe. There is no question there." "And," Harrison demanded, "get to the point, doctor." "The point, Mr. Thorne, is that you are not the biological father of Maya, nor are you the biological father of Chloe." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the air leave my lungs. Harrison stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "What kind of sick game is this? I was there when they were born. I signed the birth certificates. We've been a family for 11 years. "There's more," Dr. Sterling said, her eyes fixed on me. "Maya and Chloe are fraternal twins, dyszygotic. This occurs when 2 separate eggs are fertilized. But in this case, the DNA analysis shows that the twins have 2 different biological fathers." The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my nails dug into the wood. 2 different fathers. It was a medical impossibility, a freak of nature. "It's a rare phenomenon called heteropaternal superfecundation," Dr. Sterling explained, her tone clinical now, as if she were lecturing a group of med students. "It occurs in roughly 1 in 400 twin pregnancies. It happens when a woman releases 2 eggs during a single ovulation cycle and has intercourse with 2 different men within a 24 to 48-hour window. Each egg is fertilized by a different man's sperm." Harrison turned to me, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. You disgusting, lying." "I didn't know," I whispered, the words barely audible. "Harrison, I swear I didn't know." But as I said it, the memory I had buried for 11 years surged to the surface. June 2015. Harrison and I had been fighting for months. He had become increasingly controlling, demanding I quit my job at the firm in Portland, wanting to move to Los Angeles where his real career was. We had a massive, screaming fight on a Thursday night. I had told him I wasn't sure I wanted to marry him. He had called me ungrateful and accused me of still being in love with Caleb Brooks, the man I'd been with before him. The next night, I had gone to an industry gala at the art museum. I was drinking too much wine, feeling lonely and suffocated. Caleb was there. He had always been the one I'd truly loved, the architect who understood the soul of a building, not just the cost of the materials. We had ended up at his apartment. It was a moment of weakness, a desperate search for the woman I used to be before Harrison started molding me into something else. I had gone back to Harrison on Sunday morning. I had apologized. I had committed to the wedding. 2 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant with twins. I had convinced myself the night with Caleb didn't matter. I had convinced myself the dates didn't align. "Who is he?" Harrison hissed, leaning over the table, his face inches from mine. "Who is the man you brought into my house for 11 years? "His name is Caleb Brooks," I said, my voice shaking. "He lives in Seattle." "Mr. Thorne, please sit down," Dr. Sterling commanded. "The legalities of your marriage are not my concern. My concern is the donor. If Caleb Brooks is Maya's biological father, he has a 50% chance of being a compatible match. If he isn't and you aren't, we are looking at the National Registry, which could take months. Months that Maya doesn't have." Harrison looked at Stephanie, then back at me. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the lawyer calculating the fallout. If he wasn't the father, his sole custody of Maya was legally precarious. But he still had the court order. He still had the power. "I want him found," Harrison said, his voice cold and flat. "Not because I care about your sordid history, Elena, but because if this stranger is the only one who can save my daughter, I'll bring him here in chains if I have to, but make no mistake, this changes nothing. You are still unfit. You are still a liar. And when Maya is healthy, I will ensure you never see either of them again." He stormed out of the room, Stephanie trailing behind him like a shadow. I sat there, alone with Dr. Sterling. The machines in the distance hummed, oblivious to the fact that my world had just been detonated. "You need to call him, Elena," Dr. Sterling said softly. "You need to call Caleb Brooks tonight." I pulled my phone from my pocket. I hadn't dialed his number in over a decade, but I knew it by heart. I walked out to the quiet, darkened balcony of the 4th floor, looking out at the sprawling, uncaring lights of Lowe's Angels. The phone rang 3 times. "Hello." The voice was deeper now, weathered by time, but I recognized it instantly. It was the voice of the man I had run away from, the man whose child was currently fighting for her life in a room 3 doors down. "Caleb," I said, my voice breaking. "It's Elena. I need you to come to Lowe's Angels." The silence on the other end of the line was so heavy I could hear the phantom hum of long-distance static, a ghostly reminder of the 11 years that stretched between us. I stood on the 4th floor balcony of Lowe's Angels Children's Hospital, my fingers gripping the cold iron railing. Below me, the city was a shimmering, uncaring carpet of neon, taillights bleeding into a river of red on the 101, the distant air sirens of a city that never stops hurting. "Elena," Caleb's voice was a low vibration, thick with the kind of shock that renders a man immobile. "Is this a joke? Because if it is, it's the cruelest one I've ever heard." "I wish it were a joke, Caleb," I whispered, my voice caught in the back of my throat. "I'm at the hospital, our daughter. She has acute myeloid leukemia. She needs a bone marrow transplant and the doctors. They ran the DNA. Harrison isn't the father. They did a genetic profile, Caleb. Maya is yours." I heard a sharp intake of breath. I could almost see him in my mind, standing in his studio in Seattle, surrounded by balsa wood models and sketches of soaring glass towers. Caleb Brooks had always been a man of structures, of foundations, and I had just kicked the supports out from under his entire life. "Twins," he said, his voice cracking. "You had twins. I saw the announcement in the Portland Alumni magazine years ago. I thought they were his. I thought you moved on and built this perfect life with a man who could give you the world." "They are twins," I said, a tear finally escaping and tracking a cold path down my cheek. "But it's a medical anomaly. They have different fathers, Caleb. It sounds insane, I know. Dr. Sterling called it heteropaternal superfecundation. Chloe is Harrison's, but Maya is 99.9% you." "Maya," he repeated, the name sounding foreign and sacred in his mouth. How bad is it? She's on a ventilator. Her counts are bottoming out. If we don't find a donor match in the next week, we lose her. Harrison and I aren't matches. The doctors say because you're her biological father, you have a 50% chance of being a haploidentical match. Caleb, please. I know I have no right to ask you for anything after the way I left. I know I lied to myself and to you. But she's dying. I'll be there by morning, Caleb said, his voice suddenly hard, decisive. I'm catching the first flight out of SeaTac. Text me the room number. Elena. We're going to talk about June 2015. But right now, just hold on. I hung up and slumped against the railing, my legs finally giving out. The weight of the secret I'd been carrying, the secret I'd even hidden from my own soul, was gone, replaced by a terrifying new reality. I had spent 11 years convincing myself that the night in Caleb's apartment was a glitch, a momentary lapse in an otherwise stable trajectory toward Harrison Thorne. I had married Harrison in a white dress, walked down an aisle of lies, and birthed 2 girls into a household built on a fractured foundation. The next morning at exactly 9:15 a.m., I saw him. The hospital lobby was a chaotic swirl of doctors in scrubs and families clutching cafeteria coffee, but Caleb Brooks cut through the noise like a sharp, clean line on a drafting board. He was 42 now, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, wearing a simple navy sweater and jeans, the attire of a man who worked with his hands and his mind, a stark contrast to the performative power suits Harrison favored. His hazel eyes found mine, and for a heartbeat, the hospital vanished. We were back in Portland, back in the small, cramped apartment we'd shared during our 20s, before I let Harrison convince me that Caleb was going nowhere, and that I needed a man with real prospects. Caleb didn't say a word. He walked over and pulled me into a hug. It wasn't romantic. It was the desperate, grounding embrace of 2 people who were abo. To walk into a burning building together. I leaned into him, the scent of cedar and old paper, the scent of home, filling my senses. Where is she? He asked, pulling back, his hands steady on my shoulders. 4th floor, pediatric ICU. They're ready for your HLA draw. We walked to the elevators in a tense, purposeful silence. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, Harrison was there. He was standing by the nurse's station, looking like a vulture in a charcoal suit, sipping a double espresso and looking at his watch. When he saw Caleb, his face contorted into something primal, a mixture of classist disdain and wounded ego. He stepped forward, blocking the path to Maya's room. So the architect finally arrives, Harrison sneered, his voice loud enough to make a passing nurse pause. Tell me, Brooks, do you usually make a habit of fathering children with other men's wives, or was Elena a special project for you? Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry. He looked at Harrison with a quiet, devastating pity. I didn't know she was mine, Harrison. If I had, you wouldn't have been able to keep her from me for a single day. But right now, I don't give a damn about your pride. I'm here for my daughter. She is my daughter, Harrison hissed, stepping closer. On her birth certificate, in her school records, in the eyes of the Superior Court of California, she is a thorn. You are a biological accident. A biological accident who is currently the only person capable of keeping her alive. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the air. She emerged from a consultation room, her eyes flashing with a cold, professional fury. Mr. Thorne, if you obstruct this man's path to the lab for one more second, I will have security remove you from the building, and I will initiate a formal grievance with the Bar Association for interference with life-saving medical care. Do I make myself clear? Harrison stepped back, his jaw working. He looked at me, his eyes promising a level of legal retribution that made my blood run cold, then turned and walked away toward the waiting room where Chloe was being kept. The blood draw took 20 minutes. I stood in the corner of the small lab, watching as the nurse tied the tourniquet around Caleb's forearm. He didn't look at the needle. He looked at me. Tell me about her, Caleb said softly. Maya, what is she like? She's brilliant, I said, a sad smile tugging at my lips. She builds things, Lego sets, cardboard forts, complicated little machines. I think she got your brain, Caleb. She's quieter than Chloe, more observant. She has this way of looking at a room like she's trying to figure out how the light hits the corners. And she's stubborn. God, she's so stubborn. Caleb's eyes softened. She sounds perfect. She is, and Caleb. Chloe is there too. She's Harrison's, but she's Maya's twin in every way that matters. They've never been apart. She's struggling. After the draw, Dr. Sterling pulled me aside. Her expression had shifted from the clinical resolve she'd shown Harrison to something deeply concerning. Elena, we need to talk about Chloe, Dr. Sterling said, her voice dropping to a whisper. We ran a routine physical on her yesterday as part of the sibling donor screening. While she isn't Maya's match, her own health markers are alarming. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Is she sick too? Physically, she's malnourished, Sterling said, opening a digital file on her tablet. Her BMI is in the 5th percentile for her age. She has significant vitamin D and iron deficiencies, but more concerning are the behavioral markers. She has an irregular heart rate that spikes whenever her father enters the room. She exhibits hypervigilance. She's constantly scanning the exits and she flinches at loud noises. Elena, I've been a doctor for 30 years. Chloe isn't just a stressed kid. She looks like a child who has been living under a regime of chronic psychological trauma. The room felt like it was spinning. Harrison Thorne, the man who had convinced a judge that I was the unstable one, the man who had stolen my children to protect them, was breaking them. She's so thin, Elena, Sterling continued. Her bone density is lower than it should be. It's as if she hasn't been eating properly for months. Has Harrison mentioned any eating disorders? He hasn't mentioned anything, I said, my voice trembling with a new, sharper kind of rage. He hasn't let me speak to them in 2 years. He told the court I was an alcoholic and a bipolar mess. He used a paid-off psychiatrist to prove I was a danger to them. Well, Sterling said, her jaw tightening, the blood work doesn't lie. Chloe Thorne is not a healthy child. And if Maya is living in the same environment, her leukemia might not be the only thing she's fighting. Just then, the doors to Maya's room opened. A nurse looked out, gesturing frantically. Dr. Sterling, Maya's spiking a fever, 104.2, her H. Eart rate is climbing. Everything became a blur of motion. Caleb and I were pushed back as a crash team moved into the room. I saw Maya through the glass, her small body convulsing slightly, the monitors screaming a frantic, rhythmic warning. Caleb, I choked out, grabbing his arm. He didn't move. He stood there, his architect's eyes locked on the girl who carried his DNA, the girl he'd just met but had loved for 11 years without knowing it. She's a fighter, Elena, he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. She's mine, she's not going anywhere. But as I looked at Harrison, standing at the other end of the hall with Chloe, who was currently shrinking away from his touch, I realized that saving Maya's life was only half the battle. I had to get them out. I had to destroy the man who had stolen my past and was now starving my daughter's future. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person I knew who was more ruthless than Harrison Thorne. Victoria, I said when she picked up, this is Elena Vance. I need you. I need you to burn a man's life to the ground. Victoria Montgomery did not walk into a room. She occupied it with the calculated precision of a high-rise foundation. When she stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor of Los Angeles Children's Hospital at 7:00 a.m. the following morning, the atmosphere seemed to tighten. She was a woman in her early 60s, wearing a charcoal pinstripe power suit that cost more than my first car, with silver hair cut into a razor-sharp bob and eyes that could dissect a witness at 50 paces. She was the kind of attorney who didn't just win cases. She dismantled opponents until there was nothing left but dust and legal fees. I had met her years ago when I first moved to San Francisco, but she had been out of my reach when the first custody battle began. Now, with Caleb standing behind me and the firm's future, ironically, hinging on a project I might never finish, I had liquidated my entire personal savings to get her here. Elena, Victoria said, her voice a low, melodic rasp. She didn't offer a hug. She offered a leather-bound briefcase and a look of absolute focus. I've reviewed the preliminary filings from 2 years ago. Harrison Thorne is a clever man, but he's also a creature of habit. And men like Harrison always leave a trail of breadcrumbs. They can't help themselves. They're too arrogant to think anyone will ever look. We moved into a small, sun-drenched consultation room that Dr. Sterling had cleared for us. Caleb joined us, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours, but was fueled by a newfound, primal purpose. "This is Caleb Brooks," I said. "He's Maya's biological father." Victoria adjusted her glasses, peering at Caleb over the rims. "The architect. I've seen your work, Mr. Brooks. Solid foundations. Good, we're going to need them. Harrison is currently filing a motion for an emergency restraining order to have you removed from the hospital. He's claiming your presence is causing Maya undue emotional distress." "She's in a medically induced coma," Caleb snapped, his hands gripping the back of a plastic chair. "How much distress could I be causing?" "It's not about reality, Mr. Brooks. It's about the record," Victoria said, her fingers flying over her tablet. "But Harrison made a mistake. A massive one. He's been using his firm's resources to manage his personal affairs for years. My investigators spent all night digging into the Maya's Light Foundation." My heart skipped a beat. The foundation? He told me he'd set up a small trust for her medical bills when she was 5. He said it was mostly for college. "Maya's Light isn't a college fund, Elena," Victoria said, her expression darkening. "It's a 500 that Harrison set up 6 months ago, right when Maya started showing signs of fatigue. He's used his social circle, his law firm partners, and even local Lowe's Angels charities to raise money. The total raised is just north of $475,000. That's a lot of money," I whispered. "Is that why he waited to bring her to the hospital, to keep the fundraising going?" "It's worse than that," Victoria said. She slid the tablet across the table. It showed a spreadsheet of wire transfers. "My forensic accountant traced the outflows. Out of that $475,000, only $190,000 has actually been paid to the hospital. The rest, roughly $285,000, has been siphoned off through a series of shell companies. Pierce Holdings LLC, Thorne Equity. It's a classic laundering scheme. He's been using his daughter's leukemia to fund his own lifestyle." Caleb let out a sound that was half growl, half sob. "He stole from her. He stole from a dying child's medical fund. It's first-degree embezzlement, charity fraud, and wire fraud," Victoria said. "But that's just the financial side. I had my team look into Dr. Arthur Strauss, the man who wrote the psychiatric report that lost you custody." I leaned in, my breath hitching. "What did you find?" "Strauss had his medical license revoked in Oregon 3 years ago for professional misconduct and fraudulent billing. He was practicing without a license when he evaluated you, Elena. Harrison knew that. He paid Strauss $25,000 under the table to fabricate that report. I have the wire transfer record from one of Harrison's offshore accounts." Tears burned my eyes. He stole my life with a man who wasn't even a doctor. "He stole 2 years," Victoria corrected, her voice like cold steel. "And we are going to make him pay for every second. But there's one more thing, something far darker." Victoria paused, looking at Caleb, then back at me. She pulled a small evidence bag from her briefcase. Inside were 8 empty pill packs for a standard hormonal birth control brand, the brand I had been taking in 2015. "My investigator went to Harrison's house in Pasadena last night," Victoria said. "He let himself in. Harrison has a safe in his basement. These were inside, along with a receipt from an online pharmacy in Canada dated June 10th, 2015. I stared at the pill packs. "I don't understand. I threw those away years ago." "Look at the receipt, Elena," Victoria urged. I picked up the tablet. The receipt was for placebo hormonal replacements, visual match for ortho-tricycline. 90 capsules. The room seemed to tilt. The memory of 2015 surged back with a sickening clarity. Harrison had always managed my prescriptions. He said it was his way of taking one more thing off my plate. Every Sunday, he would set out my pills in a little silver case on the nightstand. "He switched them," I whispered, the horror of it settling into my bones like lead. "He knew I was thinking of leaving. He knew we were fighting. He switched my birth control with sugar pills so I'd get pregnant. He forced me to have children just to keep me trapped. It's called reproductive coercion, Victoria said, her voice heavy with a rare note of empathy. It is a form of domestic violence. In the state of California, it is a criminal offense. Harrison didn't just end up with twins. He engineered a biological cage. And the fact that Caleb is Maya's father was the one variable he couldn't control. It's the reason he's been so desperate to keep you away. He was terrified the truth would come out in a blood test. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the table. The man I had lived with, the man I had slept beside, had violated the very core of my autonomy. He hadn't just stolen my children, he had stolen my body. The door opened, and Dr. Sterling walked in. Her face was pale, and she was still in her surgical scrubs. "We can't wait any longer," Sterling said, looking at Caleb. "Maya's white cell count has dropped to 800. Her kidneys are starting to show signs of stress from the infection. Caleb, the HLA typing is back. You are a 5 out of 10 match, a haploidentical match. It's not perfect, but it's our only shot. We need to start the harvest now." Caleb stood up immediately. There was no hesitation, no fear. "What do I need to do?" "We'll take you to the surgical suite for a bone marrow harvest," Sterling explained. "It's a painful procedure, Caleb. We'll be extracting liquid marrow from your pelvic bones under general anesthesia. You'll be sore for weeks." "I don't care," Caleb said. "Take whatever you need. Take all of it if it means she survives." I walked with Caleb toward the pre-op area. The hallways were long and sterile, the air smelling of industrial disinfectant and the heavy scent of anxiety. We stopped at the double doors of the surgical unit. "Caleb," I said, grabbing his hand. "Thank you. I don't know how to apologize for the last 11 years. "Don't," he said, pulling me into a brief, fierce embrace. "I'm not doing this for you, Elena, and I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because she's my daughter, and for the first time in my life, I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." He disappeared behind the doors, and I was left alone in the hallway. I turned around to find Harrison standing there. He was lean and polished, his charcoal suit still perfectly pressed, but his eyes were bloodshot. He had Chloe with him. She was sitting on a bench nearby, clutching a stuffed elephant, her face a mask of terrifying apathy. "I know what you're doing, Elena," Harrison said, his voice a low hiss. "I know you brought that low-rent architect here. You think a blood transfusion is going to change a court order. You think because you found some discrepancy in the records, you can take what's mine." "She isn't yours, Harrison," I said, stepping toward him. I didn't feel afraid anymore. The fear had been burned out of me by the revelation of his betrayal. "Maya is Caleb's, and Chloe is starving. I've seen the reports, Harrison. I know you've been withholding food from her as discipline. I know about the Maya's Light Foundation. I know about the placebo pills." Harrison's expression did. "Ent change, but a muscle in his jaw ticked. You have no proof of anything." "Victoria Montgomery is in the other room, Harrison," I said, my voice rising. "She has the bank records. She has the pharmacy receipt. She has the Strauss deposition. You're not just going to lose custody. You're going to lose your license. You're going to lose your freedom. And when the FBI gets done with you, you won't have enough money left to buy a sandwich, let alone a lawyer." Harrison stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "I am a partner at Thorne and Associates. I have friends in the DA's office. I have judges who owe me favors. You're a failing architect from San Francisco with a history of instability. Who do you think the world is going to believe?" "They're going to believe the blood," I said. Just then a nurse ran out of Maya's room. "Dr. Sterling, she's crashing, VFib." The code blue alarm began to wail, a high-pitched, rhythmic scream that tore through the hallway. Doctors and nurses swarmed past us. Harrison stood frozen, his eyes wide. Chloe started to scream, a high, thin sound of pure terror. I ignored Harrison. I ran toward Maya's room. Through the glass, I saw them charging the paddles. "Clear." Maya's body jerked on the bed. "Nothing, again, 200 joules, clear." I fell to my knees against the glass, my hands pressed against the cold surface. "Please," I whispered into the sterile air. "Please don't take her yet. Not now that we finally know the truth. In the pre-op bay, Caleb was already under anesthesia, unaware that the daughter he had just claimed was slipping away. And in the hallway, Harrison Thorne stood watching his empire of lies begin to burn, his only concern not for the life of the child in the room, but for the paper trail that was about to lead him to a cell. The hospital hallway was a tunnel of sterile white, vibrating with the high-pitched shriek of the code blue alarm. It was a sound designed to trigger a primal, visceral response, the sound of a life trying to leave a body. I remained pressed against the cold glass partition of room 412, my breath hitching in a series of jagged, shallow gasps. My palms were flattened against the surface, the chill of the glass seeping into my skin. Inside the room, the world was a frantic, choreographed chaos of blue scrubs and silver instruments. Dr. Sterling was at the head of the bed, her face a mask of terrifying focus. "Increase to 300 joules, she barked. The nurse adjusted the dial on the defibrillator. The machine let out a rising whine, a sound like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. "Clear." Maya's small, frail body arched off the bed as the electricity surged through her, a violent jolt that looked more like an assault than a rescue. Her head snapped back, her eyes remaining closed, her translucent skin reflecting the harsh fluorescent glare. The monitor was a flat, unyielding line of green. "No pulse, again," Sterling commanded. I felt a hand on my shoulder, heavy and grounding. It was Victoria Montgomery. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, her presence a silent, ironclad anchor in a storm of absolute grief. "Clear." Another jolt, another silence. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator felt mocking now, a machine pumping air into a vessel that no longer had a captain. Then a flicker. A jagged, uneven spike appeared on the monitor. A slow, tentative beat broke the silence of the room. "We have sinus rhythm," a nurse exhaled, her voice thick with a relief that bordered on exhaustion. "Heart rate is 62. Blood pressure is 80/45. She's stabilizing." Dr. Sterling didn't celebrate. She began calling for a litany of medications, epinephrine, bicarb, dopamine, to bolster the fragile rhythm they had just reclaimed. She looked through the glass, her hazel eyes finding mine. She didn't smile, but she gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement before turning back to the monitors. I leaned my forehead against the glass and finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maya was still here, for now. "Come with me, Elena," Victoria said softly. "You can't do anything more here, and you're going to pass out if you don't sit down. Caleb is still in the harvest." I allowed myself to be led down the hall, my legs feeling like they were made of water. We walked past the waiting room where Harrison Thorne sat in a corner. He wasn't praying. He wasn't weeping. He was on his phone, his thumb flying over the screen, his face a mask of calculated panic. Beside him, Chloe sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her small body curled into a ball of denim and stuffed animals. She looked like she was trying to disappear into the drywall. Harrison looked up as we passed. He didn't ask if Maya was alive. "I've spoken to my associates," Harrison said, his voice a low, vibrating growl directed at Victoria. "The Maya's Light Foundation is a perfectly legal nonprofit. Every cent is accounted for as administrative overhead our treatment-related logistics. If you try to file for embezzlement, I'll countersue for defamation before the ink is dry on the petition." Victoria didn't even slow her pace. She didn't look at him. She simply said, "We'll talk in court, Harrison. Bring your checkbook," and a toothbrush. We reached a quiet alcove in the surgical waiting area, 2 floors down. The air here was still, smelling of stale coffee and industrial lavender. I sank into a vinyl chair, the silence of the hospital settling over me like a heavy shroud. My mind, unable to process the trauma of the last hour, retreated into the past. It fled to June 2015, the month my life was hijacked. I remembered the rain in Portland. It was a soft, relentless drizzle that made the city look like a charcoal sketch. Harrison and I had been living in a high-rise downtown, a place that felt more like a showroom than a home. He had already begun the process of optimizing my life. He'd told me my architecture firm, Vance and Associates, was a hobby, and that we needed to move to Los Angeles for his career. "You're a brilliant designer, Elena," he'd told me, his voice smooth as silk. "But the money isn't there. We need a future. We need a real life." We had fought for 3 days straight. I felt like I was being slowly erased, my identity being sanded down to fit into the sleek, professional life Harrison had planned for us. Then came the gala, the Portland Art Museum. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the high-pitched tinkling of champagne glasses. I was standing in front of a Rothko, a deep, bleeding red that felt like a mirror to my own soul, when I saw Caleb Brooks. He looked exactly the same as he had during our college years, disheveled, focused, his hands stained with graphite. He was standing with a small group of architects, gesturing animatedly about a sustainable housing project in the gorge. When our eyes met, the world shifted. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. Caleb knew the woman I was before I started wearing the $500 dresses Harrison bought me. We ended up in his studio that night. It was a space filled with the smell of cedar wood and old paper, models of glass towers rising from tables like a miniature city of the future. We didn't talk about Harrison. We talked about light. We talked about the way a building should feel like a living thing. And then we didn't talk at all. When I woke up the next morning in his bed, I felt a crushing, immediate wave of guilt. But I also felt alive for the first time in a year. I went back to Harrison on Sunday morning. I told him I'd had a girls' night and stayed at a friend S. I remember the look on his face, a cold, evaluating suspicion that he masked with a practiced smile. "I'm glad you're back, Elena," he'd said. "I missed you." That was the night he set out the silver pill case. "I took care of your prescriptions, honey," he'd whispered, kissing my forehead. "You have so much on your mind. Just let me handle the details." I had no reason to doubt him. Why would I? He was my fiancé. He was a successful lawyer. He was handling the details. 2 weeks later, the morning sickness began. It wasn't a gentle nausea. It was a violent, full-body rejection. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor, the cold tile against my cheek, staring at the double pink lines on the plastic stick. I should have known the math didn't add up, but Harrison was so jubilant. He had been so convincing. "Twins," he'd shouted, picking me up and spinning me around the kitchen. "Our family is starting, Elena. This is it. This changes everything. We're moving to LA next month. I've already put a deposit on the house in Pasadena." He used the pregnancy as a cage. Every time I mentioned my career or the firm, he would point to my growing belly. "You can't be working 80 hours a week now, Elena. Think of the babies. You're being selfish." By the time Maya and Chloe were born, Vance and Associates was a memory. I was a Thorne now. I was a mother. I was a stay-at-home parent in a city where I knew no one, living in a house that felt like a gilded prison. The realization hit me now, sitting in that vinyl chair with a force that made me gasp. He hadn't just switched the pills. He had known. He had known about my fight with him. He had known I was looking for a way out. He had engineered the pregnancy to bind me to him. And then, when the twins were born, he had raised them as his own, all while building a dossier against me. He had spent 10 years playing a long game of emotional and psychological warfare, waiting for the moment he could finally discard me and keep the property he had manufactured. "Elena." I looked up. Caleb was standing in the doorway of the waiting room. He was in a wheelchair, pushed by a young nurse. He looked pale, his face etched with pain, his movements stiff. A thick bandage was visible beneath his hospital gown, covering the harvest sites on his lower back. "Caleb," I said, standing up and rushing to his side. "You're out. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, his voice gravelly. Did the transplant start? Is Maya okay? I heard the alarms from the recovery room." "She crashed, Caleb," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Her heart stopped, but they got her back. She's stable. They're starting the infusion of your marrow now." Caleb reached out and took my hand. His grip was weak, but his fingers were warm. "Good. Then let it work, my blood for hers. Let it work." The door to the waiting room opened again. This time, it wasn't a doctor. It was 2 men in dark, nondescript suits. They walked with the quiet, authoritative gait of law enforcement. They bypassed Harrison, who was still on his phone, and walked straight toward Victoria. "Victoria Montgomery?" the taller man asked, showing a badge. "I'm Special Agent Nicole Hart with the FBI. We received a referral regarding the Maya's Light Fu. Endation and Thorne Equity." Harrison stood up, his face drained of color. "What is this? This is a hospital. My daughter is dying." Agent Hart turned to Harrison. Her expression was like granite. "Mr. Thorne, we are here to execute a search warrant for your electronic devices and a freeze on all Thorne and Associates business accounts related to the nonprofit. We also have a warrant to search your residence in Pasadena for records related to charity fraud and wire embezzlement." "This is a mistake," Harrison shouted, his lawyerly veneer finally cracking. "This is a malicious attempt by my ex-wife to interfere with a medical emergency." "Mr. Thorne," Agent Hart said, her voice dropping an octave, "we have the wire transfer records to Dr. Strauss. We have the offshore accounts. And we have the witness statements from the donors who thought their money was going to Los Angeles Children's Hospital, not to your private equity portfolio." She looked at the nurse pushing Caleb's wheelchair. "Please continue. We won't disturb the patient." As they led Harrison toward the hallway to conduct the search of his person, he looked back at me. For the first time in 11 years, I saw fear in his eyes. It wasn't the fear of a grieving father. It was the fear of a cornered animal who knew the hunter had finally found his tracks. Caleb watched them go, then looked at me. "Is it starting, Elena? Is the truth finally coming out?" "It's starting, Caleb," I said, looking toward the elevator that would take us back up to the 4th floor. "But it's not just the money. He's going to answer for everything. For the pills, for Strauss, for 2 years of silence." The elevator dinged. We stepped inside, the doors closing on the man who had tried to play God with our lives. As we ascended, I looked at the floor indicator, each floor bringing us closer to Maya. I wasn't just an architect of buildings anymore. I was the architect of the truth. And I was going to make sure Harrison Thorne's house of cards didn't just fall. I was going to make sure it was buried. The infusion began at 10:42 p.m. in a silence so profound it felt as though the entire hospital had held its collective breath. I stood at the foot of Maya's bed, my eyes fixed on the clear plastic tubing snaking from an IV pole into the central line in her chest. Inside that tube, a thick crimson-tinted liquid, Caleb's bone marrow, was slowly trickling into her system. It looked like ordinary blood, but to me it was liquid gold. It was 1 billion tiny seeds of life, carrying Caleb's genetic code, designed to find their way into the hollows of Maya's bones and begin the miraculous work of rebuilding her ravaged immune system. Caleb sat in a wheelchair beside me, his face a ghostly shade of gray, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a hospital blanket. He had refused to go back to the surgical recovery wing. He had insisted, threatened, really, to be present for the infusion. "It's strange, isn't it?" Caleb whispered, his voice a mere rasp. "I spent my whole life trying to build things that would outlast me. Skyscrapers, bridges, museums. I thought immortality was made of glass and steel. But it turns out it's just this. A handful of cells and a bit of hope." I reached down and squeezed his hand. "She's a Vance Brooks creation, Caleb. She was always meant to be a masterpiece. We just didn't know the blueprints had been altered." Dr. Sterling stood by the monitor, her eyes tracking the jagged peaks and valleys of Maya's vitals. "The infusion is the easy part," she said, her voice low and clinical. "The hard part is the wait. We call it the neutropenic valley. For the next 10 to 14 days, Maya will essentially have no immune system of her own. We are waiting for engraftment, the moment Caleb's cells take root and start producing healthy white blood cells. Until then, she is incredibly vulnerable." "How vulnerable?" Caleb asked. "A single stray bacterium, a minor cold, a breath of unfiltered air. It could be catastrophic," Sterling admitted. "She stays in strict isolation. No one enters this room without a gown, gloves, and a mask. And Harrison is barred from this floor entirely." A flicker of grim satisfaction crossed Caleb's face. "The FBI took his phone. I saw it happen in the hallway. He looked like a man who just realized the ground he was standing on was actually quicksand. "He's fighting back," I reminded him, the old fear prickling at the back of my neck. "Harrison doesn't know how to lose, Caleb. He's going to use every legal loophole, every favor, and every lie he has left to burn us down. Victoria said he's already reaching out to his contacts in the district attorney's office to spin the FBI warrant as harassment." Later that night, after Maya had settled into a fragile, medicated sleep, and Caleb had finally been coerced into a bed in a nearby room, I found myself in the hospital's rooftop garden. The Lowe's Angels air was cool, smelling of Car X, host, and the blooming night jasmine that clung to the trellis. I was staring at the distant silhouette of the Hollywood Hills when I heard the heavy clunk of the door. It was Caleb. He was walking with a cane now, his movements stiff and pained, but his hazel eyes were sharp with a sudden, urgent clarity. "We need to talk about June 2015, Elena," he said, leaning against the stone planter. "No lawyers, no doctors, just us." I turned to face him, the guilt I'd been carrying for 11 years finally bubbling to the surface. "I'm so sorry, Caleb. I was scared. Harrison was. He was a storm I didn't know how to navigate. He made me feel like I was failing at everything. He told me you were a distraction, a phase I needed to grow out of if I wanted a real life." "And you believed him." Caleb's voice wasn't angry, it was wounded. "I wanted to believe him," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I was 29. I was terrified of being a starving artist-architect forever. Harrison offered stability. He offered a house, a future, a name. I didn't realize at the time that those things were just the bars of a cage." I took a deep breath, the scent of the night jasmine suddenly overwhelming. "The night at your studio. It was the only time in a year I felt like I was allowed to breathe. But when I woke up, the reality of what I'd done, of the life I'd committed to, hit me like a train. I thought if I just went back to Harrison and played the part of the perfect fiancé, I could make the mistake go away." "I waited for you," Caleb said softly. "I waited at the train station that Sunday. I thought maybe you'd come back and tell me it was over with him, but you didn't. And then 2 weeks later, the news broke that you were pregnant. I saw the photos of you and Harrison at the benefit gala. You looked glowing. I told myself that if you were happy, I had to let you go. I didn't want to be the man who destroyed a family." "I wasn't glowing, Caleb," I whispered. "I was trapped. I had no idea Harrison had sabotaged my birth control. I thought it was a miracle or a curse. I convinced myself the dates didn't align because I had to. I couldn't bear the thought of what Harrison would do if he found out Maya wasn't his." Caleb moved closer, the tip of his cane clicking against the concrete. "He knew, didn't he? Not for sure, maybe, but he suspected. That's why he moved you to LA, that's why he cut off all your friends from Portland. He was isolating his assets." "He treated Maya and Chloe like assets," I agreed. "But something changed in the last year. Victoria's investigators found that Harrison's firm was under internal audit. He was losing money. His lifestyle was a facade built on credit and embezzled funds. That's when he started the foundation. That's when he started using Maya's illness as a revenue stream." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And Chloe," Sterling said, "she's malnourished. Why would a man with $500,000 in a charity fund starve his own daughter?" "Control," I said, the realization chilling me to the bone. "Harrison views food and affection as rewards. If Chloe didn't play the part of the perfect, grateful daughter, he withheld them. He was conditioning her, Caleb. He was breaking her so she would never tell anyone what was happening in that house." The door to the rooftop garden swung open again. It was Dr. Sterling. Her face was illuminated by the blue light of her tablet, and she looked grimmer than I had ever seen her. "Elena, Caleb, you need to see this," Sterling said, gesturing for us to follow her back inside. We walked to her office, a small room cluttered with medical journals and framed diplomas. She pulled up a series of high-resolution X-rays on a large monitor. "These are Chloe's scans from this afternoon," Sterling began, pointing to a series of faint, translucent lines on the girl's ribs and forearm. "They're called Harris lines. They occur when bone growth is arrested due to periods of severe malnutrition or physical trauma. Based on the spacing of these lines, Chloe has experienced at least 4 distinct periods of starvation over the last 24 months. My God, I gasped, covering my mouth. He was starving her for weeks at a time. There's more, Sterling said, switching the image to a series of brain scans. This is a functional MRI we ran to check for neurological markers of chronic stress. Chloe's amygdala, the brain's fear center, is enlarged and hyperreactive. Her prefrontal cortex, which manages emotional regulation, is underdeveloped. This is the brain of a child who has lived in a state of war-zone stress. Sterling looked at me, her eyes filled with a rare, burning empathy. Elena, Harrison Thorne didn't just neglect Chloe. He was performing a slow-motion execution of her spirit. If we don't get her away from him permanently, the damage will be irreversible. He's in jail, isn't he? Caleb asked. The FBI took him. He's in custody for questioning, Steve. Arling corrected. But his lawyers are already filing for bail. They're arguing that as a prominent member of the bar and a single father of a dying child, he isn't a flight risk. He could be out by morning. I felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline. Not if we move first. Caleb, stay with Maya. Don't leave her side for a second. If Harrison tries to come onto this floor, I want you to call security and then call me. Where are you going? Caleb asked. I'm going to find Victoria Montgomery, I said, grabbing my bag. Harrison wants to play by the rules of the court. Fine, I'm going to change the game. We aren't just filing for custody anymore. We're going to file for a total asset seizure and a permanent termination of parental rights. I walked out of the office, my heels clicking like a countdown on the sterile linoleum. Harrison Thorne had tried to build a life on a foundation of lies and stolen DNA. He had used my daughters as a currency for his own ego. But he had forgotten one fundamental law of architecture. A structure built on a fractured foundation cannot stand. And I was the one who was going to pull the final support. The morning after the transplant arrived with a pale, bruised light that bled through the reinforced glass of the pediatric ICU. The Neutropnic Valley had begun. Maya lay in a state of suspended animation, her life now a series of numbers on a flickering liquid crystal display. Caleb sat in the armchair beside her, his head lolling against his chest in a fitful, pain-racked sleep. The harvest had taken a visible toll on him. His skin was the color of damp parchment, and every time he shifted, a low, unconscious groan escaped his lips. But he hadn't left her side. Not for a second. I, however, had another mission. Dr. Sterling had moved Chloe to a step-down unit on the 3rd floor, ostensibly for observation related to her sibling donor screening, but I knew the truth. It was a protective custody maneuver disguised as medical necessity. Sterling was keeping her away from Harrison Thorne, and more importantly, she was giving me a window of time that the law hadn't allowed for 732 days. I walked down the hall of the 3rd floor, my heart drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I was carrying a small paper bag from the hospital cafeteria, a lukewarm blueberry muffin, and a carton of organic orange juice. It was a pathetic offering, a humble peace pipe for a daughter who had been taught to view me as a phantom of instability. I pushed open the door to room 308. Chloe was sitting cross-legged on the bed, her back against the headboard. She looked impossibly small in the oversized hospital gown, her collarbones jutting out like sharp, white ridges beneath her translucent skin. She wasn't watching the cartoon playing silently on the wall-mounted television. She was staring at a small plastic cup of applesauce on her tray table with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. "Chloe," I whispered, stepping into the room. She flinched. It wasn't a small movement. Her entire body recoiled as if I'd fired a gun next to her ear. She scrambled toward the far side of the bed, her eyes wide and scanning the room for an exit. "It's okay, baby," I said, my voice trembling. "It's just me, it's Mommy." Chloe's breathing was shallow, a rapid huff-huff-huff that made the thin fabric of her gown flutter. She looked at the paper bag in my hand, then back at my face. "Did Daddy say you could come in?" The question felt like a shard of glass in my chest. "Daddy isn't here right now, Chloe. Dr. Sterling said I could spend some time with you. I brought you a muffin from the cafeteria." I walked slowly toward the bed, as if I were approaching a wounded animal. I set the bag on the edge of the tray table and sat in the vinyl chair beside her. Chloe didn't reach for the bag. She didn't even look at it. She kept her eyes locked on the door. He'll be mad. He says we're only supposed to eat when he says. He says if we eat without asking, we're being gluttonous. That's a bad word, Mommy. It means you're greedy. I felt a surge of cold, white-hot fury toward Harrison Thorne. You aren't greedy, Chloe. You're a growing girl. You're supposed to eat whenever you're hungry. That's what bodies need. Not my body, she whispered, her voice so thin it was almost translucent. Daddy says Maya is the sick one, so she gets the medicine and the special shakes. But he says I'm the strong one. He says if I get fat, I won't be able to help Maya when she needs my blood. He says I have to stay efficient. Efficient? Harrison had talked about his law firm's billable hours as efficient. He'd talked about the load-bearing specs of my buildings as efficient. And now, I realized with a sickening clarity, he had applied the same cold, industrial logic to our daughter's developing body. He wasn't just neglecting her. He was optimizing her for parts. Chloe, look at me, I said, lean. Ing forward. She slowly turned her head. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. Her hair, once thick and chestnut like mine, was brittle and thinning at the temples. There was a fine, downy hair, lanugo covering her cheeks and arms, the body's desperate attempt to insulate itself when there is no body fat left to do the job. Her eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark, bruised circles of chronic exhaustion. I am so sorry, I choked out, the tears finally breaking through. I didn't know, I swear on my life I didn't know he was doing this to you. I thought you were safe. I thought he was taking care of you. Chloe watched a tear roll down my cheek. She reached out, her fingers ghosting over my skin. Her hand was so light, so frail, it felt like a bird's wing. Why did you go away, Mommy? Daddy said you found a new family in San Francisco. He said you didn't want broken girls anymore. Harrison lied to you, Chloe. He lied about everything. I took her hand in mine, marveling at how cold her skin felt even in the warm hospital room. I never found a new family. There is no one in the world I want more than you and Maya. I've been fighting him in court for 2 years. I sent you letters every week. I sent you the Lego set for your birthday and the red coat for Christmas. Chloe's eyes widened. The red coat with the gold buttons. Yes, did you get it? She shook her head slowly. Daddy said the mailman made a mistake. He said no one sent anything. The level of his cruelty was staggering. He hadn't just stolen her mother. He had systematically erased every trace of my love, replacing it with a narrative of abandonment. He had created a vacuum of affection and then filled it with his own twisted brand of control. Just then, the door opened. It wasn't Harrison. It was Dr. Sterling, followed by a woman in a dark suit with a clinical, no-nonsense air. Elena, this is Dr. Harrison Thorne. No relation to Harrison, Sterling said, her voice tight. She's a forensic pediatrician from the Child Advocacy Center. We need to perform a full skeletal survey and a clinical documentation of Chloe's physical state. Chloe shrank back, her hand flying to her throat. Am I in trouble? No, sweetheart, Dr. Harris said, her voice remarkably gentle. You aren't in trouble at all. We just want to take some pictures and some measurements so we can help your body get strong again, like Maya's. I stayed in the room as they worked. I watched as they measured the circumference of Chloe's upper arm, a number so small it made Dr. Harris pause and close her eyes for a second. I watched as they documented the brittle texture of her nails and the way her heart rate spiked to 140 beats per minute just from the stress of being touched. Elena, a word, Dr. Sterling signaled toward the hallway. We stepped out, leaving Chloe with the forensic specialist. Sterling leaned against the wall, her face etched with a profound professional grief. We found something else, Sterling said, handing me a printout of Chloe's dental x-rays. Look at the enamel on her molars. It's severely eroded. This isn't from poor hygiene. It's from chronic exposure to stomach acid. Is she purging? I asked, the word feeling like a curse. No, Sterling said. It's called rumination syndrome. It's often seen in children who have been subjected to extreme food insecurity or trauma. They involuntarily regurgitate food as a way to self-soothe, or because their digestive system has literally forgotten how to process a full meal. Chloe's body is in such a state of chronic fight or flight that her parasympathetic nervous system has basically shut down. "He's killing her, Elizabeth," I said, the rage now a cold, vibrating thing in my chest. "He's killing one daughter with leukemia and the other with a cage of his own making." "Victoria Montgomery is waiting for you in the cafeteria," Sterling said. "She has the FBI's preliminary report on Harrison's bail hearing." I ran to the cafeteria. Victoria was sitting at a corner table, surrounded by stacks of legal folders and 2 empty espresso cups. She looked like a general preparing for the final assault. "Bad news first," Victoria said, not looking up from her tablet. "Harrison's lawyers are good, very good. They argued that the charity fraud was an accounting discrepancy and that the offshore accounts were part of a legitimate international legal practice. He's out, Elena. He posted a $500,000 bond an hour ago." "He's out," I shouted, drawing looks from the nearby tables. "He's out on the street while Chloe is in that bed with Harris lines on her ribs." "He's out, but he's under a no-contact order with the hospital," Victoria said, her eyes flashing. "If he steps foot on this property, he goes straight back to a cell. But Harrison doesn't care about orders. He cares about his image. And right now, his image is a man whose wife is manipulating his sick children." "What's the good news?" I asked. "Ed," my voice trembling. "The good news is that we have the search warrant returns from his house in Pasadena," Victoria said, pulling a grainy photo from a folder. "My investigator found a hidden room in the basement. It wasn't a panic room, Elena. It was a study for the girls. It had no windows. It had a lock on the outside, and it had a camera system that fed directly to Harrison's phone." I felt the air leave my lungs. "He was filming them." "He was monitoring them," Victoria corrected. "Every minute of every day, we've recovered the hard drives. There are hundreds of hours of footage of Chloe sitting in that room waiting for him to come home. We have footage of him disciplining her. He didn't hit her, Elena. He was smarter than that. He just ignored her for 12 hours at a time. He would put a plate of food on a high shelf where she couldn't reach it and tell her she could have it when she learned to show proper respect." I stood up, my chair screeching against the floor. "I'm going to kill him." "No," Victoria said, grabbing my wrist with a grip of surprising strength. "You're going to be a mother. You're going to stay here with Chloe and Caleb. You're going to let me and the FBI handle the killing. Because tomorrow, we aren't just filing for custody. We are filing a criminal complaint for torture of a minor under California Penal Code 206. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I see you, Elena. I see the architect trying to play lawyer. You think you can take my life? You think you can take my daughters? I built this family, and I will burn it to the ground before I let a failure like you have a single piece of it. Enjoy the hospital. It's the last time you'll see them in one piece." I showed the screen to Victoria. "He's spiraling," Victoria said, her face pale. "This isn't a lawyer talking. This is a man who has lost his grip, Agent Hart." The FBI agent, who had been sitting 2 tables away, stood up immediately. "Harrison Thorne just sent a death threat to the petitioner," Victoria said, handing her the phone. "I want a protective detail on Maya and Chloe's rooms, and I want a warrant for Thorne's immediate arrest for witness intimidation." "On it," Hart said, already reaching for her radio. I looked up at the ceiling, thinking of the 3rd floor where Chloe was finally eating a blueberry muffin, and the 4th floor where Caleb's marrow was fighting for Maya's life. Harrison Thorne was out there in the sprawling, neon-choked night of Lowe's Angels, a man with nothing left to lose, and a mind built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated malice. "Victoria," I said, my voice finally steady. "He said he'd burn it all down. He wasn't talking about the case." "What do you mean?" "The house in Pasadena," I said, the memory of Harrison's obsessive control over property clicking into place. "He's not going to run. He's going to erase the evidence. The hard drives, the basement room, Chloe's clothes. He's going to burn the house." Before Victoria could answer, the hospital's PA system crackled to life. "Code red, level 2. North Wing, all personnel to your stations. This is not a drill. I looked out the cafeteria window. In the distance, toward the hills where the Pasadena mansions sat like ivory fortresses, a column of thick, black smoke was already rising into the sky. Harrison Thorne wasn't waiting for the trial. He was starting the execution. The shrieking of the code red alarm was a serrated blade cutting through the fragile peace of the pediatric oncology wing. It wasn't the rhythmic, clinical chirping of a heart monitor. It was the raw, industrial roar of a building in crisis. On the television screens throughout the cafeteria, the code red graphic flashed in a violent, pulsing crimson. North Wing, Victoria Montgomery whispered, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the hospital's internal map on her tablet. The ICU and the step-down units are in the south and east wings. This is a diversion, Elena. Harrison is creating a theater of chaos. He's here, I choked out, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He sent that text, and now the hospital is on fire. Victoria, he's coming for the girls. Agent Nicole Hart already had her service weapon unholstered, though she kept it low against her thigh as she moved toward the elevators. I want a full lockdown on rooms 412 and 308. Now, she barked into her radio. Perimeter teams, we have a possible code 4 suspect on site. Dark coat, charcoal suit. Approach with extreme caution. I didn't wait for the elevators. I took the stairs, my lungs burning, the scent of ozone and faint, acrid smoke beginning to drift through the vents. My mind was a kaleidoscope of terror. I saw Maya's pale face behind the glass. I saw Chloe's fragile frame shrinking into the hospital bed. When I burst onto the 4th floor, the hallway was a sea of blue-scrubbed personnel moving with practiced, frantic speed. Panic was a sea. Contagious thing, vibrating in the air like high-tension wires. Elena, get back. It was Caleb. He had managed to drag himself out of his bed, his face a mask of sweat and agony, leaning heavily against the doorframe of Maya's room. He was holding his cane like a club, his hazel eyes wild with a protective, primal light. Where is he? I screamed, rushing to his side. I don't know, Caleb wheezed. Security is swarming the floor. They've got the elevators locked out. Dr. Sterling is inside with Maya. She's not leaving her. Chloe, I gasped, turning back toward the stairs. She's on 3. Caleb, he's going to go for the one who isn't behind a sealed airlock. I flew down the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway here was quieter, but the tension was thick enough to taste. At the end of the corridor, near room 308, I saw a figure. He wasn't in a charcoal suit. He was wearing a dark, oversized hospital janitor's jacket, a cap pulled low over his brow. He was pushing a large industrial laundry cart toward Chloe's door. Harrison, I shrieked. The figure stopped. He slowly straightened, the janitor's jacket hanging off his broad shoulders. He turned, and even under the shadow of the cap, I recognized the cold, aristocratic lines of his face. He wasn't angry. He looked serene, a man who had finally transcended the limitations of the law and entered a state of pure, unadulterated madness. You always were too loud, Elena, Harrison said, his voice echoing in the sterile hallway. You don't understand the architecture of a legacy. You think you can just demolish what I've built. You think you can hand my property over to a man who builds with mud and sticks. She's not property, Harrison, I shouted, moving toward him. He reached into the laundry cart and pulled out a heavy, industrial-sized canister of accelerated oxygen, the kind used for welding in the hospital's maintenance shop. Beside it, I saw a flare gun, the orange plastic reflecting the harsh, fluorescent light. The North Wing was just a trash fire, Harrison said, his thumb ghosting over the trigger of the flare gun. But this is a purification. If I can't have them, if I can't be the one who saved them, then no one will. I'll burn the record clean, Elena. I'll take them back to where we started, to nothing. Drop the weapon, Thorne. Agent Hart appeared at the other end of the hall, her weapon leveled at Harrison's chest. Now, drop it or I will fire. Harrison didn't flinch. He looked at the flare gun, then at the oxygen canister. You think a bullet is faster than a spark, Nicole. In a room with a 20% oxygen concentration, I don't need to aim. I just need to breathe. The door to room 308 opened a crack. I saw Chloe's wide, terrified eyes looking out. "Chloe, stay inside," I screamed. "Lock the door." Harrison's eyes shifted toward the door. For a second, the serenity vanished, replaced by a twitching, violent hunger. "Chloe, come to Daddy. We're going on a trip, just like I told you." "No," Chloe's voice was a small, vibrating thread of courage. "Mommy says you lied. Mommy says you're the one who's sick." The rejection hit Harrison harder than a bullet. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unbridled rage. He raised the flare gun toward the oxygen canister. In that split second, Caleb Brooks appeared behind Harrison. He had come down the back service stairs, ignoring the pain in his pelvis, moved by a desperation that defied medical limits. He didn't use a gun. He used his cane, swinging it with every ounce of his remaining strength against the back of Harrison's knees. Harrison buckled. The flare gun discharged, the orange projectile hissing past Agent Hart and burying itself in a fire-retardant curtain at the end of the hall. Caleb didn't stop. He threw his entire body weight onto Harrison, pinning him against the industrial cart. "Get him," Caleb roared. Agent Hart and 2 hospital security guards swarmed over them. It was a violent, tangled struggle of limbs and shouting. I ran past them, throwing my shoulder against Chloe's door, locking it from the inside the moment I was through. I pulled Chloe into my arms, the two of us sinking to the floor as the sounds of the struggle continued in the hallway. I held her so tight I could feel her tiny, irregular heart beating against my chest. "He's gone, Chloe," I whispered into her hair. "He's never coming back, I promise on the sun and the stars." 2 hours later, the hospital was beginning to settle into a stunned, ash-scented quiet. Harrison Thorne had been led out in handcuffs, his face bloodied, his charcoal suit finally ruined. This time, there would be no bail. The flare gun, the oxygen canister, and the witness statements from Agent Hart and Caleb had upgraded his charges to attempted murder and arson. I sat in Victoria Montgomery's war room, a private consultation office she had commandeered near the legal wing. Victoria was sitting with a man I hadn't seen before. He was in his late 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that looked like they had seen every dark corner of the world. "Elena, this is Frank Bishop," Victoria said. "He's a private investigator. He's been working the financial side of the Montgomery strategy." Frank nodded at me, his expression grim. "Mrs. Vance, I've been digging through Thorne's digital footprint. While he was busy trying to set the hospital on fire, his cloud servers were being mirrored by the FBI. I found something that puts the final nail in the coffin." He opened a laptop and turned it toward me. "This was recorded 7 months ago. It's from a hidden camera in Thorne's study in Pasadena. He didn't know it was recording. He thought he'd turned it off after a meeting with a fixer named Victor Kine." The video was grainy, the audio muffled by the hum of an air conditioner, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Harrison. He was sitting at his mahogany desk, a glass of scotch in his hand. "I need this handled permanently," Harrison said on the recording. "The Elena problem. She's starting to ask questions about the Strauss report. She's looking for a new lawyer. I can't have her sniffing around the foundation." The other man, a broad-shouldered figure in a dark jacket, leaned forward. "You're talking about a permanent solution. That's a high-tier request, Thorne. That's not a custody hearing." "I don't care what it costs," Harrison snapped. "Use the Pierce Holdings account. Make it look like an accident, a car crash, a mugging. I don't care. Just make sure she never walks into a courtroom again." I felt the blood drain from my face. He tried to have me killed. "Conspiracy to commit murder," Frank Bishop said, closing the laptop. "And we have the paper trail of the $50,000 down payment from the Foundation's administrative fund. He used Maya's cancer money to hire a hitman to kill her mother." Victoria Montgomery leaned back, her face a mask of absolute clinical victory. "The Montgomery strategy is simple, Elena. We don't just win the custody. We erase the man. With this video, his parental rights will be terminated by the end of the week. His law license will be revoked by the morning. and he will spend the next 20 to 30 years in a federal penitentiary. I looked at the window, where the sun was beginning to rise over Lowe's Angels. For the first time in 11 years, the shadow of Harrison Thorne was gone. "What about the girls?" I asked. "Maya, the transplant." "The engraftment has begun," Dr. Sterling said, walking into the room. She looked exhausted, her scrubs stained with soot from the North Wing fire, but her eyes were bright. "We ran a blood count 20 minutes ago. Maya's white cell count has ticked up to 950. Caleb's marrow is working, Elena. She's rebuilding." I stood up, my legs finally steady. I looked at Caleb, who was sitting in a chair in the corner, his pelvis bandaged, his hand resting on his cane. He looked at me and gave a small, weary smile. "We built it, Elena," he whispered. "A foundation that holds." The firm in San Francisco was gone. Marcus had texted me that the Chicago clients had officially pulled out. Hayes and Morrison Architecture was bankrupt. I had no job, no savings, and a legal battle that was just beginning. But as I walked back to the 4th floor to see Maya, with Chloe holding my hand on one side and Caleb walking beside me on the other, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't an architect of empty towers. I was an architect of a family. And this time, the blueprints were written in blood. The 10th day after the transplant felt like the longest century in human history. We were deep in the Neutropnic Valley, a clinical term that sounded like a geographical feature of purgatory. Maya was sequestered behind a high-tech airlock in room 412, a world of pressurized air and HEPA-filtered silence. To enter her room, I had to undergo a ritual of decontamination that felt more like a religious rite than a medical protocol. Scrubbing my hands until the skin was raw, donning a yellow gown that crinkled with every movement, and pulling a sterile mask over my face until my own breath was the only thing I could hear. Inside the room, Maya looked like a porcelain doll left in the sun for too long. Her hair was completely gone now, her scalp smooth and pale, reflecting the soft blue light of the monitors. She was awake but barely present, her dark eyes, Caleb's eyes, tracking the movement of the dust motes dancing in the filtered air. Caleb sat on the other side of the glass, a permanent fixture in the hallway. He was still using his cane, but his color was returning. He looked like a man who had finally found his center, even if that center was currently a high-stakes biological gamble happening inside a 10-year-old girl's bone marrow. "Any movement?" Caleb asked through the intercom, his voice a low vibration in my ear. She squeezed my hand this. "Morning," I whispered, looking at Maya. "Just a tiny flutter, like a bird's wing. But Dr. Sterling says her temperature is holding at 99.4. No signs of infection." 950, Caleb said, referring to her white cell count from the 6:00 a.m. draw. "We need it to hit 1,000. That's the magic number for engraftment. That's when we know the marrow has officially taken up residence." While Caleb watched the monitors, I spent my afternoons in Victoria Montgomery's temporary war room on the 2nd floor. The Montgomery strategy was no longer about a simple custody modification. It had evolved into a forensic excavation of Harrison Thorne's soul. Frank Bishop, the investigator, was hunched over a laptop, surrounded by stacks of bank statements and wire transfer receipts that looked like a paper trail leading straight to hell. "Elena, look at this," Frank said, pointing to a series of invoices from a company called Northwest Specialty Medical Consulting. Between March and July of this year, the Maya's Light Foundation paid this company exactly $125,000 for advanced diagnostic services and treatment planning. The invoices are signed by a Dr. Leonard Klein. "Dr. Klein?" I asked. "I've never heard of him. Dr. Sterling is Maya's lead oncologist. She handles all the consults." "That's because Dr. Leonard Klein doesn't exist," Frank said, a grim smile touching his weathered face. "I've checked the American Medical Association, the California Medical Board, even the international registries. There is no Leonard Klein. I traced the banking for Northwest Specialty. The account is registered to a shell company in the Caymans. The signatory on that account, Harrison Thorne." The level of the betrayal was breathtaking. Harrison hadn't just siphoned the money, he had fabricated an entire medical shadow world to justify the theft. He had written fake invoices for fake doctors while Maya was bruising and bleeding in her bed at home. He used $65,000 of it as administrative fees for himself, Victoria added, her fingers flying over her own tablet. But here is the final nail, Elena. Frank found a $25,000 wire transfer from Harrison to Dr. Arthur Strauss, dated 6 weeks before your 2023 custody hearing. My stomach did a slow, painful roll. The payoff. Exactly, Victoria said. And because Strauss's medical license was already revoked at the time of the evaluation, the payment constitutes not just bribery, but fraud upon the court. We are filing a motion this afternoon to vacate the 2023 custody order in its entirety. It's as if that ruling never happened. Legally, we are resetting the clock to the moment before Harrison took them. What about Harrison? I asked. Agent Hart said his lawyers are still fighting. Harrison is in a high-security wing of the county jail, Victoria said. The conspiracy to commit murder charge changed the math for him. No judge in this state is going to grant bail to a man caught on video hiring a hitman to kill the mother of his children. But he's still a lawyer, Elena. He's filed a counterpetition from his cell. She paused, her expression becoming uncharacteristically soft. He's using the DNA results, Elena. He's accepted that Maya is Caleb's, but he's double-downed on Chloe. He's arguing that since he is her biological father, confirmed by the same hospital that outed him on Maya, the court cannot strip him of his constitutional parental rights, regardless of the criminal charges. The logic was as cold as it was terrifying. Harrison knew he was going to prison. He knew Maya was gone, but he wanted Chloe. He wanted to keep one piece of his property as a weapon against me, even from behind bars. I left the war room and went down to the 3rd floor. Chloe was in the physical therapy gym, a small, brightly lit room filled with colorful mats and balance beams. She was working with a young therapist named Melissa, trying to walk a straight line while carrying a beanbag on her head. She looked better. Her skin had lost that translucent, grayish hue, and she was eating small, frequent meals of high-protein shakes and soft fruits. But the Harris lines on her ribs were still there, a skeletal record of the man who claimed to be her father. "Look, Mommy," Chloe shouted, her face lighting up with a genuine smile that nearly broke me. I did 10 steps without wobbling. "You're amazing, Chloe," I said, sitting on a bench and watching her. "You're getting so strong." Melissa, the therapist, gave me a subtle nod. "She's a fighter, Elena. Her muscle memory is coming back fast, but we're still seeing some hoarding behavior. She's hiding granola bars in her pillowcase. It's a common trauma response to food insecurity." I watched Chloe laugh as she dropped the beanbag, and I felt a surge of protective fire. Harrison Thorne would never touch her again. I didn't care about constitutional rights. I cared about the little girl who was terrified of being hungry. At 4:00 p.m., Dr. Sterling called Caleb and me into her office. She was holding a printout of the latest lab results, and for the first time in 10 days, she looked like she wanted to celebrate. "Engraftment," Sterling said, the words sounding like a symphony. "Maya's count just hit 1,050. The marrow is producing. Caleb, your cells are officially Maya's cells now. Her system is starting to wake up." Caleb slumped back in his chair, his eyes filling with tears. "She's going to make it." "She has a long road ahead," Sterling cautioned. "She'll need months of outpatient care and a very strict environment. But yes, Caleb, the immediate danger is over. She's coming out of the valley." The relief was short-lived. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a call from Victoria. "Elena, get to the legal wing. Now, the King County prosecutor just called. There's been a development with Victor Kine, the man in the video." I ran down to the 2nd floor. Agent Hart was there, looking grim. "We picked up Victor Kine 2 hours ago," Hart said. "He's talking. He's looking for a plea deal, and he's giving us everything. He didn't just meet with Harrison once, Elena. He's been on Harrison's unofficial payroll for 2 years. He's the one who facilitated the Strauss evaluation. He's the one who moved the foundation money to the Caymans." And, I asked, sensing there was more. Kine has a recording of his own, Hart said, turning on a television in the conference room. It's an audio file from his phone. It was recorded 2 weeks before Maya was admitted to the hospital. The audio was clear. I heard Harrison's voice, sharp and impatient. She's getting worse, Harrison said on the tape. The bruising is all over her legs now. If I take her in now, the foundation money stops. The Maya's Light campaign is at its peak. I need another 2 weeks, Victor. Just 2 more weeks of fundraising and then I'll bring her in. It's just a virus. She can hold on. She looks like a ghost, Thorne, Kine's voice replied. If she dies in that house, you're looking at manslaughter. She won't die, Harrison snapped. She's a Thorne, she's efficient. We just need the final $100,000 from the Chicago benefit. Then we'll go to the hospital. The room went cold. Caleb, who had followed me down, let out a choked sound of pure horror. Harrison Thorne hadn't just waited to bring Maya in. He had calculated the value of her life against the peak of his fundraising campaign. He had let her bleed internally so he could hit a specific target on his balance sheet. This is depraved indifference to human life, Agent Hart said, her voice like ice. We're upgrading the charges to attempted first-degree murder and felony child endangerment. And Victoria, I think we have enough to petition for the immediate termination of parental rights for both children, based on extreme psychological and physical torture. I walked back up to the 4th floor, my mind reeling. I stood at the glass of Maya's room, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. Caleb's marrow was in her bones. The truth was in our hands. But as I looked at the dark, sprawling city beyond the hospital windows, I realized that Harrison Thorne's final move was still coming. He was a man who had built his life on the extraction of others, their money, their autonomy, their DNA. And as the elevators dinged, revealing a courier with a stack of legal papers, I realized that the extraction of Harrison Thorne from our lives was going to be the most violent project I had ever designed. The fluorescent lights of Victoria, Montgomery's temporary office on the hospital's 2nd floor, seemed to hum with a low-frequency anxiety. It was 3:00 a.m. on a Thursday, the hour when the world feels most fragile, and the truth has a way of becoming sharp enough to draw blood. Victoria sat behind a desk cluttered with digital tablets and physical evidence bags. She looked up as I entered, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the hour, but her eyes were tired. Beside her sat Frank Bishop and Special Agent Nicole Hart. They weren't looking at bank statements anymore. They were looking at a series of high-resolution images of small, white tablets. "Elena, sit down," Victoria said, her voice a quiet, commanding rasp. "We've spent the last 6 hours with the forensic team from the FBI's digital evidence and toxicology units. We've managed to reconstruct the sabotage files from Harrison's cloud backups and the physical evidence recovered from his safe." Frank Bishop slid a tablet across the table. It was a PDF of a search history from June 2015, the month I had been in Portland, fighting for my career and my autonomy. "Harrison didn't just order placebo pills, Elena," Frank said, his voice grim. "He conducted a systematic feasibility study. Look at these search terms." I leaned in, my stomach churning as I read the list. How to dissolve hormonal birth control without residue. Chemical stability of sugar-based placebo. Os in orthotricycline packaging. Tactile comparison of Pfizer-manufactured pills versus generic placebos. Average time for ovulation recovery after cessation of hormonal contraception. "He was a lawyer, Elena," Frank continued. "He treated your body like a case file. He wasn't just switching the pills, he was testing the texture, the weight, even the way they felt between a finger and thumb, to ensure you wouldn't notice a difference in the silver case he set out every Sunday." Agent Hart stepped forward, placing a lab report on top of the tablet. "We recovered 8 empty pill packs from the safe in Pasadena. Our toxicology lab ran a microswab on the blister seals. We found 0 traces of ethinyl estradiol or norgestimate, the active hormones in your prescription. Instead, we found traces of high-fructose corn syrup and microcrystalline cellulose, sugar and filler." "He stole my choice," I whispered, the weight of the violation settling into my chest like lead. He watched me take those pills every night for months, knowing they were empty. He watched me get sick, watched me panic about the timing, and he just smiled. It's more than just a violation of trust, Elena, Victoria said, her eyes flashing with a cold, professional fire. In the state of California, this falls under reproductive coercion and aggravated domestic battery. By sabotaging your medication to force a pregnancy, he committed a crime against your bodily autonomy. This evidence, combined with the Strauss payoff and the charity fraud, creates a narrative of a man who views everyone around him, especially his wife and children, as biological property to be manipulated for his own ends. Agent Hart leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. And then there's the permanent solution file. We've finished the metadata analysis on the Victor Kine video. It wasn't just a single meeting. We found encrypted messages dating back to the week you filed for the initial custody appeal in 2023. She pulled up a series of text messages on the monitor. Thorne, the petitioner, is becoming a nuisance. She's found a firm in San Francisco. If she gets a discovery order, the Strauss report won't hold up under cross-examination. Kine, what do you want? Thorne, I want a clean break. No witnesses, no petitioner. I need a car accident or a home invasion that goes wrong. I have the schedule for her San Francisco studio. She's there late on Tuesdays. I felt the air leave my lungs. Tuesday nights. I was always there until midnight, working on the Obsidian Heights project. He was tracking you, Elena, Hart said. He had a GPS tracker on your car for 6 months. We found the logs on his laptop. The only reason Kine didn't move forward was because Maya got sick. Harrison realized that if you vanished, while Maya was in the hospital, the scrutiny would be too high. He put the hit on hold so he could focus on the Maya's Light fundraising. He prioritized his profit margin over my life, I said, a hollow laugh escaping my throat. I should be surprised. I really should. Victoria leaned forward, her expression becoming sharp. Harrison's lawyer, David Miller, is filing an emergency petition as we speak. He's going to argue that the DNA evidence, the fact that Caleb is Maya's father, actually proves that Harrison was the stable parent who raised a child that wasn't his with love and devotion. He's going to paint you as an adulterous liar who deceived a noble man for 11 years. But we have the sabotage files, I reminded her. Yes, but Harrison will argue that he only switched the pills after he discovered your infidelity, as a way to save the marriage, Victoria countered. He's a master of the counter-narrative, Elena. He's going to try to turn the trial into a referendum on your character. He's going to use your one night with Caleb as a weapon to justify every crime he's committed since. I stood up, my legs shaking but my heart finally steady. Let him try to explain to a judge why a noble father starves his other daughter until she has Harris lines on her ribs. Let him explain why he stole $300,000 from a child's cancer fund. Let him try to spin the hitman as marital therapy. Just then, the door opened. Caleb Brooks stood there, leaning heavily on his cane, his face pale but his eyes bright with a quiet, devastating resolve. He's not going to get the chance, Caleb said, his voice a low vibration. I just spoke with the managing partner of Thorne and Associates. Harrison's own firm just voted to expel him. They're filing their own lawsuit for embezzlement and conduct unbecoming of a member of the bar. They're handing over his internal emails, Victoria. Every message he sent from his work account about the Strauss report and the foundation. Victoria smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that reminded me why she was the most feared attorney in the state. Then we have him. Between the firm's cooperation, the FBI's digital forensics, and the forensic pediatrics report on Chloe, Harrison Thorne isn't going to a custody hearing. He's going to a sentencing. We walked back up to the 4th floor. The hospital was quiet, the only sound the distant, rhythmic hiss of the ventilators. I stopped at the glass of Maya's room. She was sitting up in bed, her dark eyes, Caleb's eyes, fixed on a book of architectural sketches Caleb had brought her. Chloe was there too, sitting on a chair beside. The bed, carefully peeling a clementine. She wasn't hiding the peels in her pillowcase. She was sharing them with the nurse. I looked at Caleb. He was watching Maya, a look of profound, terrified love on his face. He had saved her life with his marrow. He had saved our future with his presence. "We're almost there, Elena," Caleb whispered. "The blueprints are final. Now we just have to survive the demolition." My phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus in San Francisco. "Elena, I don't know how you did it, but the Chicago clients just called back. They saw the news about the Thorne case. They're saying they want to stand with a woman of such resilience. They're re-signing the Obsidian Heights contract. $2.8 million, Elena. We're not just saved, we're soaring." I looked at my daughters, then at Caleb, then out at the sprawling, uncaring lights of Lowe's angels. Harrison Thorne had tried to play God with my body, my career, and my children. He had used the architecture of the law to build a cage. But he had forgotten one thing. I was an architect too, and I knew exactly which supports to pull to make his world come crashing down. "Victoria," I said into my phone as we reached the elevator, "tell the prosecutor we're ready. No deals, no mediation. I want him to see every single piece of evidence in open court. I want the world to see what he did to us." The elevator dinged. As the doors closed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in 11 years. The sabotage files were closed. The truth was out. And tomorrow, Harrison Thorne would find out what happens when you try to bury a woman who knows how to build. The King County Superior Courtroom was a chamber of polished oak and cold, unforgiving marble smelling of floor wax, and the heavy, stagnant air of institutional judgment. It was a space designed to intimidate, to reduce human complexity to a series of exhibits and docket numbers. I sat at the petitioner's table, my back straight, my hands folded on top of a legal pad. To my left sat Victoria Montgomery, a silhouette of charcoal wool and silver sharp-edged intent. To my right sat Caleb Brooks. He wasn't in a hospital gown anymore. He wore a dark suit that made him look like the successful architect he was, though he still leaned slightly on a mahogany cane, a physical testament to the marrow he had surrendered for our daughter. Across the aisle, the seat usually occupied by Harrison Thorne was empty. He appeared on a high-definition monitor mounted to the wall, beamed in via a secure link from the high-security wing of the county jail. He wore an orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with the aristocratic lines of his face. He looked haggard, his dark hair uncombed, his eyes darting toward the camera as if he were looking for a way to litigate his way out of the lens. Beside his image stood David Miller, his face a mask of professional exhaustion. He was a man who had realized he was representing a sinking ship, and he was just trying to keep his own head above water. Judge Maria Alvarez entered at exactly 9:00 a.m. She was a woman in her late 50s with eyes like flint and a reputation for being the most discerning jurist on the family court bench. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the stacks of evidence that had been compiled over the last 14 days. The forensic pediatrics report on Chloe, the sabotage files, the financial audits of the Maya's Light Foundation, and the Victor Kine video. "Please be seated," Judge Alvarez said, her voice a calm, rhythmic authority. "We are here for the final evidentiary hearing and custody determination in the matter of Vance versus Thorne. Given the gravity of the criminal charges pending in federal court, this proceeding will focus strictly on the immediate and permanent welfare of the minors, Maya and Chloe Thorne." Victoria stood, her voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. "Your Honor, the evidence presented in our pretrial brief is not merely a request for a modification of custody. It is a chronicle of a systematic, decade-long assault on the bodily autonomy of Elena Vance and the physical and psychological integrity of 2 children. We have documented reproductive coercion, first-degree embezzlement of medical funds, and a pattern of starvation that has left Harris lines on the skeletal structure of a 10-year-old girl." David Miller rose for the defense, his voice sounding hollow. "Your Honor, my client maintains that his actions were motivated by a desperate attempt to maintain a stable family unit after discovering the petitioner's infidelity. He admits to mistakes in his financial management, but he remains the only father these girls have ever known. To strip a biological father of his rights to Chloe, who is his genetic daughter, is a constitutional overreach." The Constitution does not grant a father the right to starve his child to maintain stability, Mr. Miller, Judge Alvarez said, not even looking up from her note. Proceed Ms. Montgomery. For the next 4 hours, the architecture of Harrison Thorne's life was demolished, piece by piece. Dr. Elizabeth Sterling took the stand, her clinical testimony about Maya's leukemia and Chloe's malnutrition vibrating with a rare, professional fury. Frank Bishop walked the court through the Cayman's accounts and the fake invoices for Dr. Leonard Klein. But the turning point came when my mother, Catherine Hayes, took the stand. I hadn't seen her in 2 years. She looked older, her face etched with a profound, quiet regret. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears before turning to the judge. I believed Harrison, Catherine said, her voice shaking. I told my daughter she was the problem. I told her to go back to him even when she begged me for help. I saw the girls once a year, and Harrison always had an excuse for why they were so thin, why they were so quiet. He was a lawyer. He was a good man. I prioritized my own comfort over my daughter's safety, and I will live with that shame for the rest of my life. But I saw the forensic photos of Chloe. I saw what a good man does when no one is watching. Harrison Thorne is a monster, Your Honor. He is a monster who wears an expensive suit. The courtroom was silent. Harrison, on the monitor, let out a jagged, mocking laugh. She's a senile old woman, David. Tell the judge she's been on antidepressants for years. Judge Alvarez looked at the monitor, and for the first time, I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated loathing in her eyes. Mr. Thorne, one more outburst and I will mute your feed and conclude this hearing without your presence. By 3:00 p.m., the evidence was concluded. Judge Alvarez didn't retreat to her chambers. She sat at the bench, her pen moving across a series of legal forms with a deliberate, rhythmic scratch. The court finds the testimony of the petitioner, the medical experts, and the forensic investigators to be not only credible but devastating, Judge Alvarez began. The 2023 custody order was obtained through fraud upon the court, specifically the fabrication of a psychiatric report by a man practicing without a license. That order is hereby vacated, ab initio, from the beginning. She looked at the camera, her voice dropping an octave. Mr. Thorne, your conduct toward Chloe and Maya constitutes a pattern of physical and psychological torture that this court finds irredeemable. The biological tie you share with Chloe is not a license for abuse. It is a responsibility you have systematically and violently abdicated. She struck her gavel. The parental rights of Harrison Thorne to both Maya and Chloe are hereby terminated, permanently and without the possibility of appeal. Full legal and physical custody is awarded to the petitioner, Elena Vance. A permanent, lifetime restraining order is issued, prohibiting Harrison Thorne from any contact, direct or indirect, with the minors or the petitioner. I slumped against Caleb, a sob finally breaking free of my throat. It was over. The cage was open. 2 days later, I stood in the hallway of the federal courthouse, watching as Harrison was led away in handcuffs. The federal trial for charity fraud, wire embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder had ended in a plea deal Harrison's lawyers had scrambled to sign. He had been sentenced to 25 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for 18. He didn't look at me as they led him to the transport van. He looked at the floor, his empire of lies reduced to a pair of silver handcuffs and a prison bus. I walked out of the courthouse and drove straight to the hospital. Maya was being discharged. 6 months had passed since the transplant. Her dark hair was growing back in a thick, curly fuzz. Her color was high, her spirit vibrant. She was sitting on her bed, packing her sketchbook into a brand new backpack. Chloe was there too, her cheeks finally rounded, her eyes bright with a quiet, certain peace. She wasn't scanning the exits anymore. She was watching a video on Caleb's phone, laughing as he explained the structural engineering of a Lego castle they were going to build. Ready to go home? I asked, standing in the doorway. San Francisco home or Los Angeles home? Chloe asked, her voice steady. San Francisco home, I said, where the fog is thick and the buildings are made of glass, and Caleb is coming with us.